Today, the hills of Verdun are a hauntingly beautiful shade of green. They hide a secret that remains etched in the earth. Beneath this grass lies a graveyard of empires. In 1916, this wasn't a forest, it was a lunar wasteland of mud and steel. Welcome to the longest battle in human history. A story of endurance, madness, and a cold-blooded plan to end a nation. By late 1915, the Great War had stopped moving. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, millions of men were stuck. They lived in ditches, surrounded by rats, lice, and the constant threat of a sniper's bullet or a random shell. It was a stalemate of the most brutal kind. Neither side could break through the barbed wire and machine guns. The world was watching the Western Front, waiting for someone to blink. But the generals were running out of ideas. Enter General Erich von Falkenhayn, a man who looked at war not as a conquest, but as a mathematical equation. Falkenhayn wrote a secret memo to the Kaiser. He argued that Germany didn't need to capture land to win the war. He believed that if Germany attacked a place the French were forced to defend at all costs, they could destroy them. His philosophy was chillingly simple. Bleed the French army white. Kill so many men that France simply ceases to exist. The target was Verdun, an ancient city protected by a ring of massive concrete fortresses. Verdun sat in a salient, a bulge in the line, surrounded by German artillery on three sides. It was a strategic trap. But more than strategy, Verdun was the heart of French pride. Losing it would be a blow to the national soul. Falkenhayn gathered 1,200 cannons. He was about to unleash a storm of steel, the likes of which man had never seen. February 21st, 1916, 7:15 a.m. The earth near Verdun didn't just shake, it screamed. 1,200 German guns fired simultaneously, launching over 1 million shells in just 10 hours. This wasn't just a bombardment, it was Trommelfeuer, drum fire. The shells fell so fast and thick that the individual explosions merged into one continuous, bone-rattling roar. For the French soldiers in the front lines, the world became a nightmare of flying dirt and jagged metal. Entire trenches were erased in seconds, burying men alive before they could even reach for their rifles. The German plan was to pulverize the French defenses so completely that their infantry could simply walk across the ruins. As the sun began to set on that first day, the barrage lifted. From the smoke, the first wave of German stormtroopers emerged. They moved like ghosts through the craters, armed with flamethrowers and grenades. The French survivors, deafened and dazed, crawled out from the debris. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Small groups of Poilus held onto shell holes, firing until they were overrun. Every meter of mud was bought with blood. By the end of the first week, the French front line had buckled. The Germans were closing in on the great fortresses. Panic began to spread through the French high command. Verdun, the gateway to Paris, was about to fall. But in the chaos, a new voice emerged, General Philippe Pétain. He was a man of logistics and calm. He had one simple order: they shall not pass. The mill was starting to turn, and it would grind both sides into the dust. The pride of the French defense was a sleeping giant, Fort Douaumont, a massive concrete beast, the strongest point in Verdun. To the French public, it was invincible. But due to blunders, the fort had been stripped of its garrison and heavy artillery. On February 25th, a small group of German Brandenburger soldiers approached the fort, expecting a bloodbath. Instead, they found silence. They captured the strongest fortress in the world without firing a single shot. The news hit Paris like a physical blow. The invincible Douaumont had fallen in an afternoon. French morale plummeted. But for the men on the ground, this was just the beginning. The constant rain and millions of shells turned the earth into a putrid soup. This wasn't just dirt, it was a graveyard. Every explosion unearthed the remains of those who had fallen weeks before. The smell of decay mixed with the sharp tang of mustard gas. To survive, the Poilus had to be as hard as the stone. Pétain realized that no man could endure this hell for long. He implemented the Noria system, a constant rotation. While the Germans kept the same divisions in the line until they were destroyed, Pétain moved his men in and out. This meant that eventually nearly the entire French army would pass through the meat grinder of Verdun. They were being ground down, but they were not breaking. Endurance became the only form of victory. Falkenhayn watched the casualty numbers rise. His experiment was working, but Germany was bleeding too. By spring, the battlefield was a wasteland of fire and bone. The mill on the Meuse was turning faster and faster. Verdun was no longer just a battle. It was a test of who could disappear last. And Pétain was ready for the long haul. As spring turned into a scorching summer, the fighting shifted to a new, smaller nightmare. Fort Vaux. Trapped in dark, humid corridors, French soldiers fought floor by floor, room by room, against flamethrowers and grenades. They were cut off from water, forced to lick the condensation off the walls just to stay alive. Verdun was a peninsula of French territory surrounded by German guns. Only one narrow road remained open. This was the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. If this road stopped for even an hour, Verdun would fall. Pétain turned it into a conveyor belt of survival. Every day, 3,000 trucks rumbled along this muddy artery. One truck passed every 14 seconds, 24 hours a day. Thousands of soldiers stood along the path, shoveling stone into the ruts, even as the wheels turned. They never stopped. They were the heartbeat of the nation. Meanwhile, the German artillery reached a new level of terror. Among them was Big Bertha, a massive howitzer that could shatter the thickest concrete with a single shell. The landscape was no longer recognizable. No trees, no grass, no landmarks, just a grey, pulsing sea of mud. Then came the gas. Not just chlorine, but phosgene and mustard gas. A silent, choking fog that crept into every crevice. Soldiers lived in masks, their world reduced to the smell of rubber and the sound of their own panicked breathing. The mill on the Meuse was no longer just a battle. It was a machine, and that machine was hungry for more than just territory. It was consuming the very youth of Europe. The Noria system was more than just a logistic miracle. It was a psychological treadmill. Every French soldier knew their turn would come. They watched the trucks return, filled with broken men. Not just those wounded by iron, but those shattered from within. This was the birth of shell shock. Men staring with hollow eyes, their bodies trembling at the sound of a distant door slamming. On the German side, the situation was turning grim. Falkenhayn's mathematical equation was failing. He had expected to bleed the French dry, but the German army was bleeding just as fast. The mill was grinding both nations to bone. In June, the Germans made one last, desperate push. They used a new weapon, green cross gas, a highly concentrated phosgene. It was a gas that could bypass older filters. They captured Fort Souville, the last high ground before Verdun. From its ramparts, German officers could finally see the spires of the Verdun Cathedral through their binoculars. They were only 3 miles away. It felt like the end. Verdun was almost within their grasp. But the French defenders, gasping for air and blinded by chemical mist, didn't retreat. They fought for every shell hole. This was the peak of the French agony. In the mud and gas, the distinction between man and beast vanished. At home, the voix sacrée never rested. The trucks kept coming, the nation's blood kept flowing toward the Meuse. Verdun had become a black hole, sucking in the resources of two empires. Everything was consumed by the mill. And as summer peaked, a new sound began to rumble far to the west. The British were preparing their own big push. The tide was about to turn, but the cost was already unimaginable. Verdun's shadow would never leave them. July 1st, 1916. Far to the west, along the River Somme, the horizon erupted. The British big push had begun. For the Germans at Verdun, the effect was immediate. Falkenhayn was forced to move his reserves and guns away to face the British. For the first time in 5 months, the drum fire over Verdun began to fade into an eerie, ringing silence. But silence at Verdun didn't mean peace. It meant the French were preparing to take back what was theirs. General Pétain had been promoted, and in his place came General Robert Nivelle and the aggressive General Charles Mangin. Mangin was nicknamed the Butcher. He didn't want to just endure, he wanted revenge. He wanted to crush the enemy. Mangin perfected a new tactic, the creeping barrage, a curtain of artillery fire that moved just ahead of the infantry. In the autumn mists, the French gathered a massive force. On October 24th, they prepared for the ultimate strike. After a colossal bombardment that shook the very foundations of the earth, the French Poilus rose from their trenches. They weren't the same men who had retreated in February. They were hardened, bitter, and unstoppable. They surged toward Fort Douaumont, the giant that had been lost so easily months before. In a whirlwind of smoke and bayonets, French colonial troops and infantry stormed the concrete heights. By nightfall, the French flag was once again flying over the strongest fortress in the world. The German dream of bleeding France white had collapsed. Falkenhayn was dismissed, his career in ruins. He was replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. But the change in leadership couldn't change the reality. The mill was still turning. The momentum had shifted, but the mill was not finished. As winter 1916 approached, the mud of Verdun froze into iron-hard ridges. General Mangin set his sights on the next objective, Fort Vaux. On November 2nd, the Germans, realizing it was a tomb, evacuated. The French marched back into the ruins they had defended so fiercely months earlier. It was a victory of stones and ghosts. By December, the German offensive was a failure, but the French wanted one last blow to push the lines back to where they started. On December 15th, under a sky heavy with snow and iron, the final masterpiece began. The roar could be heard in Paris. The creeping barrage was now a precision tool. French infantry moved like a blue wave, recapturing miles in just days. They took 11,000 German prisoners, men so exhausted they simply sat in the mud and waited to be captured. On December 18, 1916, 10 months after the first shell was fired, the Battle of Verdun officially came to an end. 10 months. Over 300,000 lives extinguished. Another 400,000 wounded or missing. For nothing. The landscape was no longer part of France. It was a zone rouge, a red zone of unexploded shells and poison. The mill finally stopped turning, but it left behind a generation that would never truly come home. Years later, they built a house for the bones. The ossuary of Douaumont, where 130,000 unidentified men rest together, French and German, side by side in the dark. In death the mill finally made them equals. Today, nature has tried to cover the wounds. The grass is green, the trees have grown back. But if you look closely, the earth is still uneven. The scars of 1916 are still there, waiting to remind us of what happens when the world goes mad. Verdun was more than a battle. It became a defining scar on the French soul, a memory that would last for generations. For Germany, it was the moment the dream of a quick victory finally died. The myth of Prussian invincibility lay buried in the mud. Philippe Pétain emerged as the Lion of Verdun, a national hero whose prestige would last for decades, for better and worse. But this victory came with a fear of another meat grinder, leading France toward a defensive obsession that would fail them later. Falkenhayn's chilling strategy of attrition remains a dark warning about the cold-blooded math of total war and human value. Even today, the earth of Verdun yields its iron harvest, as farmers uncover tons of unexploded shells every year. The Zone Rouge remains a restricted wasteland, too saturated with poison to ever be safely farmed or inhabited again. In the Douaumont ossuary, the unidentified rest together, a silent plea for a world without such madness. Verdun proved that while machines could destroy, they could not break the stubborn, gritty will of the common soldier. We remember the Poilus, those bearded men who stood in the mud and gave everything for a few miles of dirt. History is the story of those who endured the impossible, reminding us that every peace is bought with an unimaginable price. As the sun sets over the Meuse today, the echoes of the cannons finally fade into the whispers of the wind. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Never forget the cost of glory. Ancient myths, history in motion.